Okay, thank you, Wade. My name is Forrest Schaefer. I'm the state coordinator of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. And I'm here today to moderate a panel focused on aligning regional investments. I would consider this a mega panel because we have 3 panels all focused on the same topics, but slightly different focus areas for each one of them. And I have to say that aligning regional investments is a topic that rings very true for me. Up until a couple of years ago, I was working in the Central Sierra, really on that grind of how do we get the next grant? How do we apply for it? How do we get all of the different sources that we need, combining local money, combining private money, combining federal grants and state grants to bring that together to really meet our objectives and our plans. And then in the last couple of years, having the chance to work with a lot of our funding partners, really seeing a lot of the challenges and how difficult it is to roll out these large amounts of funding, to get it on the ground in effective ways, to know what that funding is accomplishing. And so today, we're going to focus on some of those challenges, but also on some of those key opportunities for moving forward to meet so many of the funding challenges, better make our funding go further, and some of the things we heard about earlier today. So here's the overview today. I'm going to provide first some quick background just to set the stage. We'll move into our first panel then, who's already seated, on state and federal frameworks to show how state and federal agencies are adapting their frameworks to be more consistent with each other and with regional needs. We'll then move into our second panel called Expanding Partnerships, to show how we're moving outside of our silos, outside of our lanes, to think about other people, other investors that we need to be partnering with to make this work more effective. And then finally, we'll move into regional approaches to show how the regional approach that the task force is emphasizing can really help spur region-wide funding coordination and priority setting. So first on the background, I'm going to provide a couple of the task force actions that are really relevant to a lot of this work. Going to cover some of the key grant sources that fund this work, and this was an interesting exercise to really try to wrap one's arms around all of the different methods that a collaborative has to help move this work forward. And then I'm going to speak a little bit on the need for alignment. So a couple of these actions that I want to share, these 3 actions are really the most relevant, and it's these 3 actions from the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. They've really spurred a lot of our discussions and a lot of our work with funding partners and regional partnerships to have this discussion that we're having here today. First is expanding the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program, which now covers nearly every fire-adapted and fire-prone region throughout the state. Which is helping to build that network of regional community and landscape resilience plans, and also resulting in that pipeline of shovel-ready projects and investment strategies. So I'm going to move on to some of our key grant sources. First, I want to say what I'm focused on. I'm focused on funding sources that collaborative groups focused on landscape and community resilience might typically pursue. I'm only showing grant awards that are usually above $1 million per year. And there's a very real chance that there are key sources that I'm not aware of, or that we might not be aware of as a task force, because this funding world is so large. But some of the key ones that I was familiar with as an implementer, and that you might be familiar with most, but not all, I'll show in just a second. So first I'm going to start with the CAL FIRE programs. And as you see these programs, they're actually showing up in relative size to the amount of funding. This is based on fiscal year 23 funding. So we see some of our really popular, really important grant sources like Forest Health, which includes reforestation as well as wildfire prevention. But we also see a lot of other really focused programs on business and workforce development, programs like CFIP and wildfire resilience, which are focused on assistance to small private landowners, focused programs on tribal and wildfire resilience and urban and community forestry. And then finally, there's the home hardening program, which is joint with Cal OES. With the Department of Conservation, we have the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program, which we'll be hearing more from Mary here today. The state conservancies throughout the state also have wildfire-focused funding through multiple wildfire programs. And the OPR also has programs. These are not specifically focused on wildfire. This is regional climate resilience and market development, but they are do have a heavy focus on the enabling conditions to be able to move forward with wildfire work. Next, moving on to the U.S. Forest Service. Significant funds in urban and community forestry, one of the most important grants for community protection focused work over the past couple of years has been the Community Wildfire Defense Program. We have Wood Innovations, which is aligned with CAL FIRE's business and workforce development work. And then we have a couple of opportunities that are really focused on Forest Service collaboratives and landscape scale collaboratives like Joint Chiefs and CFLRP. Natural Resources Conservation Service is an important funder through EQIP and a few other grant programs, also to support small private landowners. BLM has an annual Community Wildfire Assistance Grant Program, which tends to only get a few applications a year. Now you know that this one exists as well. It's available on grants.gov. And one of the other programs that we'll be covering today is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funding. This is primarily using federal funding through a nonprofit private organization to be able to get that work on the ground. And then finally, a really key piece to note, because it's so instrumental to so many fire safe councils and community-focused organizations throughout the state, are grants offered by the California Fire Safe Council, often funded by federal funds, Forest Service funds, and or CAL FIRE funds. So that is the picture, but this is only the picture for 1 year. The process for accessing these funds, just because it's on there, is all different. Just because you have a project doesn't necessarily mean that that project may apply. Certain projects will only apply to certain applicant types. I'm not including some really important grant sources like tribal funds, like local government funds, like almost every sort of private funding sources. And those are really essential to set baseline funding to be able to have the capacity to go out and get these other funds, but they're so decentralized that we don't really have a central way to shift them. And then the final point I want to make here is that this funding landscape is shifting rapidly. This picture is going to look completely different in 2024. Some programs will be gone, some new programs will be added, and the size and shape of all of those in terms of how they fit together is also going to be immensely different. So the final piece I want to say before we move on to the discussion is we're not trying to restrict this concept. We're focused on grant sources with what I just presented, but we don't really want to focus our discussion just on grant sources because we recognize that partnerships, how we're working across boundaries, how we're sharing resources with technical assistance and training are also really important components of how we're coordinating our investments. So next, I'm going to summarize just some of the key needs for why we're having this discussion today. First, we need to make our funding go further. We need to align and optimize our investments, as Wade said. From the funder side, we need to make sure that funders have the tools they need to make more informed investment decisions and to make sure that those actions that they're taking and those investments that they're making are making a difference. On the implementer side, we need to make sure that funders, that regional partnerships and practitioners can maintain their investments and capacity over time, which means making these funding sources available, accessible, and that they're minimizing administrative burden. And then finally, we need to broaden out our funding sources so that we're not just thinking about that little pool, not little, but that focused pool of wildfire focused work to think about how could we utilize watershed focused funding for headwaters or habitat and biodiversity funding to restore forests and restore forest habitat. And not to mention prescribed fire and the enduring and broad benefits that prescribed fire can provide. So that's enough for me. And I'm excited now to move over to our panel. We set the stage and we're going to be hearing how state and federal agencies are adapting their frameworks to support the objectives we just discussed, as well as some of the challenges involved in doing so. And so I'm going to jump right, before I do this, I'll just mention, we're going to have brief remarks from each panelist, just about 5 minutes or so each, and then we're going to go right into discussion with the executive committee. And we're looking forward to hearing your questions, thoughts, and discussion with the panelists. I'm going to start right in. Our first panelist is Liz Berger. Liz is the Deputy Regional Forester for Resources with the Pacific Southwest region of the U.S. Forest Service, more commonly known as Region 5. So Liz, my question for you is, what are some of the U.S. Forest Service's key priorities, both from a nationwide context, but also specifically in California?
Okay, thanks, Forrest, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. Jen had mentioned this, but our number one priority is really around the wildfire crisis strategy. So we've been talking about that a lot here with the task force and for the last several years, really looking at reducing wildfire risk to protect communities, critical infrastructure, and natural resources. So that's our number one priority, and that is for the region and nationally. So Chief's priority as well. Second priority is post-fire recovery, disaster relief. The nice thing here is we actually got money to tie in with the disaster relief. So we have disaster supplemental on this one to help, and then we have the Replant Act to help us meet our reforestation goals. Lastly, our third priority is around visitor experiences and public access and enhancement. This really ties in with equity. So equity is folded into this. We want all visitors to National Forest to feel welcome and included. And so this is a big component on this. Jen had mentioned Reimagine Recreation as a priority. That's tied in here too. So all of these priorities are really centered in the national priorities as well, Forrest.
Great, thank you, Liz. And I've heard it twice now. You said at the top, wildfire crisis strategy, number one priority. And at these task force meetings, we've talked a lot about these wildfire crisis strategy landscapes. What we haven't talked a lot about is, what does the strategy mean? You know, we've been very focused on these landscapes, Southern California, you know, heavy early investments to really make sure that that work is moving forward. But what does the wildfire crisis strategy, what's the approach that it's taking in terms of all lands and et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good question. Here, of course, we've outlined the different landscapes that we have. But you can see that from the map for California here, zooming in on the west, that there's a lot of high-risk fire sheds. So it's not just about the landscapes. We're looking at all of the high-risk fire sheds on federal land and non-federal lands, so state, private, tribal lands as well. Many people think the wildfire crisis strategy is a Forest Service thing. Of course, there's a lot of people here that realize it's not. When we speak about the wildfire crisis strategy, people think, okay, that's for the Forest Service, but we have an all lands approach. And the nationwide view on this is really to treat 20 million acres nationwide on the Forest Service lands, and then 30 million acres. So it's actually a larger number on non-Forest Service lands. And I think Patrick showed it really well in the slides that he shared on the investment on non-federal lands. It's huge. So the investment's not just on National Forest System. And we know that fire has no boundary. Jurisdictional boundaries do not matter in this case. So we have to work together. And we've heard it a lot here. It's all about the partnerships. So we have to invest there too. Wade, I know we heard you talk about paradigm shift. So the wildfire crisis strategies are really big paradigm shift for the Forest Service, because we had strategies in the past, but they didn't have the resources to go with it. So they didn't have the funding or the workforce. So this last 2 years, we've actually had the funding to pay for increasing our capacity. So we've hired 30% more people than what we've had in the Forest Service. We've also had historic investments, and we saw the picture around that. So over $1 billion. And I know we've been talking about reductions moving into 24 and beyond, but the good thing on the Forest Service and really the state side is we've been able to combine our resources, invest them with partners, a huge variety of different partners, and that all came up in the previous slide that you shared for us. So then we can implement our work into the out years. So we might have had a large upfront investment, but then that helps us out into the future. So the wildfire crisis strategy, it really is a 10-year strategy, and we heard you talking about 10 years. It's not an annual strategy that would align with annual appropriations, and that's a big change for us. So when we see all the grant opportunities, they're not just for National Forest System lands, they're combined with many partners, big collaboratives, building on what we've already done in priority areas where we can both agree between the state, Fed, and other partners, the communities, on where we should invest our resources. We're not doing the random acts of conservation that we've done in the past. That's completely shifted. And then we have the right dollar amounts to actually get the work accomplished. So we have a lot of examples of that. You know, we can share more, but really it's all about the partnerships. And I think we've seen that some of the previous slides. If you go to the next slide, we kind of focus in on where some of this work has been been done. And this one focuses in on the landscapes in the north part of the state around Reading, but the Klamath Basin and the Trinity landscape. And you can see, this is just a zoom in here from the dashboard, that there's many different types of treatments done and they're all focused in the same areas. So we don't have one project here, one project there. That makes a big difference when we're looking at increasing pace and scale, which is a big component of the wildfire crisis strategy.
Great. Liz, thank you. Thank you for mentioning really the importance of the cross-boundary work and with the visual here too. This is actually relevant to what you just said. This is a map of federal land ownership in California. Federal agencies own 46% of the land base in California. If you're just considering fire adapted and fire prone landscapes, that number goes way up. But we can also see that it's a patchwork, so it really helps demonstrate that need. Also, apropos, Trevor McConkey is here with us today. Trevor McConkey is actually, I think, our first out-of-state presenter. Trevor's with the Washington Department of Natural Resources, where he's the Federal Lands Assistant Division Manager. But he's here today because Trevor's also the chair of a committee of the Western Council of Western State Foresters, which is focused on Good Neighbor Authority, doing multi-state coordination around Good Neighbor Authority, which you may be aware of as a key tool for being able to move state resources, county resources, tribal resources on the federal lands to support that work and also to support cross-boundary implementation. So Trevor, I'll turn it over to you. Can you describe Good Neighbor Authority to us and what sort of Good Neighbor Authority work you're involved with?
Sure. And that last slide's a great picture because what you're looking at is
Can you reduce the distance to the microphone?
Sure.
Just slide it towards you.
Yeah, there we go. So I just want to talk about that slide there for a second. That is a very common picture on Western states. And that's one of the reasons why Good Neighbor exists, because at some point in time, someone said, wow, we have a really big need and we basically don't have the workforce to meet that need. So Good Neighbor was kind of born out of that. But we'll go to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I'm here today kind of speaking on behalf of kind of all the states, but primarily from Washington, because that's where my specialty is from. And for those that don't know what the Good Neighbor Authority is, it is basically a federal authority that's handed down through the Farm Bill. And it was permanently authorized in 2014. And you're going to say, that's great. That's another tool in the 6,000 tools that we have. But it actually is different than that. And what you're seeing in front of you is an example of that, because there's a broad sort of movement that's occurring with states across the West where they're beginning to step up and basically through the process of using Good Neighbor, turn to someone like Liz or like Jen and say, your problems are our problems because your forests are in our state. And that's a big change versus just saying, here's some money for you to go work on your own stuff. You go, nope, we're going to own those problems with you. So through the authority, we are authorized to do forest land, watershed, and rangeland restoration. With originally, it was just the BLM and the Forest Service, so Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service. And just recently, that was expanded to the National Park Service and also to the National Fish and Wildlife Service. So what you're seeing is a trend. This trend of opening up federal lands to work with state, tribal, and county partners because there's a recognition that they need help. And that's one of the things that states bring to the table is expertise and skill sets. So the numbers there are just some things to be aware of. I do want you guys to be aware of that. Those numbers involve very little from California. In fact, less than 1% of those numbers are from California. So how the tool is being utilized here is it's being underutilized. That's the way I would describe it. So let's go to the next slide. So GNA in Western states from a funding standpoint, it's really a business tool. And that's something for you guys to be thinking about as you really come into, asking the question of should we really engage with this or not? Because we have all these other tools. Well, when you're running towards a fiscal cliff, like we all are, you have to turn over every stone. Okay, like every stone. And Good Neighbor is a really big stone that hasn't been turned over here. The numbers that you see are sans California. They don't have any information from California. Imagine what would happen to those numbers and to those outputs and all those widgets if California turned on and actually leaned into it the way the other states were. There's been a huge investment from states themselves, as well as with, in some of the states, like in Oregon or in Idaho and Montana, private industry has invested in it because they understand the importance of it.
Anything else? Oh, do you want me to ask?
Yeah,
I
go to
was
the
about
next.
ask my next
Yeah, go to the next
now.
question. I
Alright.
was just leaning
Okay.
into it. Yeah.
All right, so my next question is, where are you seeing success throughout the Western US? What does that success look like?
Yeah. Are we seeing success? Well, the numbers speak for themselves, but that's just numbers, and that's not really what's important. What is actually as important is what's happening on the ground at a relationship level. You talk about partnerships, and I call Good Neighbor is a relationship. It's a long-term committed relationship because we're working under a law that's permanently authorized. What's amazing about it is that it's going in a direction that it's not going backwards. And so this group here and the work that you guys are doing is an example of that concept of working together. Good Neighbor takes it to the next level, and it really starts to push the boundaries of what that relationship is, because you're willing to share the risk and the reward of working on federal lands when you do this. What it is and the way it's being successful is you're seeing, again, you're going to hear, I hate to use buzzwords of alignment and priorities, but that's really what you're seeing is an alignment of how states are viewing federal lands and the challenges that exist, and realizing that because there's such a large land base within a lot of these Western states, if states don't lean in, they're missing a big opportunity, and Good Neighbor is one of the ways that you can actually step in to do it. The business function of what I haven't really talked about is the fact that through the use of Good Neighbor, one of the functions that happens with it is you can actually develop your own source of revenue through it. And that's a really important function of it, because revenue is developed through an economic function. It's not developed as an appropriation, which with a fiscal cliff, it's typically related to appropriation issues that are on the horizon. So with using an economic function to develop revenue, you have a completely separate funding source that's unrelated to a lot of the challenges that happen at the appropriation level. And we put this slide in as just to kind of illustrate sort of what's happening across the states. When you look at the investments that are occurring, you can see where the states are leaning in, and it's really apparent what's happening with California. And the reason for it is you guys have 100 other tools. I mean, this group is a great example of that. And so the question is, why would you want to use Good Neighbor? Well, when you're coming into a situation that you need to begin to looking at different ways to fund things, Good Neighbor offers a phenomenal business tool that actually uses multiple funding sources to accomplish the work. But it's more than that, because what it is you're really trying to change the culture of how we're approaching land management. And you see this happen is once a state starts and once the Forest Service leans in, there is this thing that happens, and it's amazing, where an incredible momentum builds behind it. There's a reason why Good Neighbor is a national priority for the National Association of State Foresters. There's a reason it's one of their top priorities. There's a reason we created a committee. So when I'm asked about is there success, you have to think about it that way, that we've reached a point that we had to justify creating a committee for this because it was needed that level of support because it was having that much momentum behind it. And what's crazy is we've only been doing it for really 3 or 4 years, like in full picture, and we're just getting started. And I anticipate that we'll be really accelerating it more in the coming years.
Excellent. Thank you, Trevor. I think it reinforces the point that I heard from Director Acefa that we're not in this alone, and there's opportunities to look to other Western states, other people facing the same challenges. I do want to say, just from learning from Trevor through our process of discussing Good Neighbor Authority, we definitely have some really successful Good Neighbor Authority agreements in the state. But I'd say the philosophy feels a little bit different compared to other Western states. Fire Adapted 50 is a great example where CAL FIRE and Resource Conservation District and the U.S. Forest Service partnered to really do a cross-boundary fire prevention work. But as you can see, we have not had the projects that really generate that alternative revenue. I'm going to move next to Mary. Mary McDonald is a grant manager with the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program at the Department of Conservation. So I'll just jump right in. Mary, can you tell us more about the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program and specifically how it's resulting in regional priority plans?
Yes, certainly. Sound okay? So thank you. Yeah, the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program, or the RFFC program, basically does two things. We support capacity building for block grantees or our regional partnerships for them to respond to their critical planning, administrative, technical, and coordinating needs related to forest health and fire resilience. We also support large-scale forest health planning. Now, that planning takes the shape of our grant's major deliverable, the Regional Priority Plan, or the RPP. Now, I have to say, although plan is in the name, they're not plans. They're meant to work as tools for regions to organize long-term programs of work to really prioritize and advance forest health and fire resilience priorities and initiatives. But being California, every region is different. Every region has a different landscape with different needs, and so all the regional priority plans are very different. At this stage in our program, well, I will say, even though they're so different, we do have core elements that they all need to have just to have some sort of consistency and communicability across plans. But regardless, each region has taken this task with a different approach, and they're at a different stage of readiness across the board. So you see in this slide here, we're at different stages, and we talk about readiness in 4 stages: initiated, in development, complete or near complete, and activated. And I'll explain the difference between those last two. So we think of a complete RPP as one that has all those core elements that I mentioned. They're checking the boxes, but an activated RPP means that it's a piece of planning infrastructure that a region has incorporated into their land stewardship work moving forward. So again, it's not a written plan, but it's a resource that's being used to make more work possible. And at this stage, you see we have nearly half of our grantees in the complete or near complete stages and activated stages.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, so now that you're seeing these regional priority plans come online, what are some of the big surprises or takeaways that you're getting as you're starting to sort through these? And then my second piece is, what are you hearing from partners about what this new planning framework is enabling for them?
Yeah, so through our partners, we're seeing bigger projects come online, more multi-benefit projects, and in every region, we're seeing more coordination, which is really exciting. We're also seeing when we empower our place-based practitioners to not only do this work, but also just talk to each other and get coordinated, that naturally brings in multiple benefits, and it naturally just creates more impacts, more resilient landscapes, and more resilient communities. But at the same time, I will say, we're also hearing and seeing that putting together these larger projects and these more multi-benefit projects is just really hard. It takes a ton of effort and time on our regional partnerships or on our grantees to kind of communicate all those different objectives, to pull together all those different funding sources, like we saw the map of funding sources earlier, and then to get things implemented and then meet reporting requirements that change from program to program. So, for example, one project might require 8 different funding sources just to meet all these different stewardship objectives, and that only just piles on administrative burden. So we're seeing our grantees and our regional partners hustle to implement these larger and more impactful projects. But at the same time, we're recognizing at the state, we're not coordinating to that same extent. And we feel like in our program, in the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program, we need to address that inefficiency, and we feel like we can do some more. So a first step we're taking is building out a framework that really aims to capture and communicate all the different information being pulled together in these regional priority plans. We recognize that this is a need to be able to characterize our partners' work in a way that relates to the different programs and priorities across agency partners. So what we're trying to do is just create something clear, something consistent, representative, and something that just really characterizes what you can expect within a given region. And then that's something that we hope that other agencies can really engage with effectively. And really what's happening is our partners are already responding to statewide and federal resilience priorities and goals. And what we need to do is just better demonstrate that alignment. And that's what we hope to do with this tool, this framework. So I would say to finish, to wrap up, our biggest takeaway is that it's our job at DOC. I mean, like in the RFFC program, it's our responsibility to make sure what we've asked these grantees to do. To make a regional priority plan, we need to make sure that those plans have connection points, so that other decision-making agencies that all have their own priorities, objectives, and mandates they have to respond to, so they can see where they clearly already fit into these plans. So we hope, we have more work to do, obviously, to finalize and really to get it in action, but we really hope that this can support the regional investment strategy and connect our partners with the relevant decision-making agencies and really, I hope, make sure that it's less administrative work and more impacts on our land and people.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. So yeah, we've really been seeing the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program and these regional priority plans as the framework to really make sense of the work that's happening on the landscape and really help direct those investments in a way that is accountable to funders and helps understand really what the benefits of that work will be. And one of the key funders of this work, as we saw on the slide earlier, is CAL FIRE. And of the CAL FIRE programs, Forest Health Program is the largest and has been a very a constant, dependable, and very important source for landscape partnerships, as well as a lot of our regional partnerships developing regional priority plans. We have with us today Shannon Johnson. Shannon is a registered professional forester, and she's the staff chief of Forest Health, Wood Products, and Bioenergy with CAL FIRE. Shannon, can you tell us a little bit more about the Forest Health Program? And I'm particularly interested in how it's evolved over the past several years.
Yeah, sure. So for those that don't know, CAL FIRE's Forest Health Program, it funds landscape scale land management projects that conduct restoration and reforestation activities aimed at providing more resilient and sustained forests. It's funded through the California Climate Investment, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Funds. The first solicitation was actually in 2014, and we've grown exponentially since then. So I'm just going to highlight some of the changes that have occurred in that program in the last 10 years. So originally, our application was joined with the Forest Health Research and Forest Legacy, and now we're just traditional Forest Health. We went from a 2-stage application process to a 1. We used to have our grantees actually perform their own greenhouse gas calculations. Now we actually provide that in-house. Our guidelines and grant reporting has changed over the last 10 years as our funding has changed. We've also expanded our agreements. So originally they're about 2-year agreements. Our more recent ones are actually 6 years. So recognizing that as these projects are getting larger, we're giving more time to actually complete them. Similar to our funding. So originally we had 14 million. Our last solicitation, we awarded 107 million. So our funding has also been increasing over the last years. And while it was traditionally the greenhouse gas reduction, we have had a mix of general fund. And this year we're actually receiving the timber regulation and forest restoration fund. So that's another pool that's going to be coming in, which might have some changes to how we actually implement our grant program. We've also recognized the importance of collaborating with other agencies. So when we actually get our applications in, we work with Department of Conservation, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife or Forest Service. If other agencies are available, Fish and Wildlife, to review, we ask them to review to provide input on our applications, along with internally our units, our regions, our other programs. So reforestation, business and workforce, tribal welfare resilience, any programs that we think might be able to provide information on our applications, we want that review. We've also tried to leverage our funds to have them go further by working with other grant programs. So if we see something where our application can benefit from another program, we make sure that we're in communication with them so that they can try to also help fund it. So one of the other things that we recognized was the need to bolster efforts between different agencies, just because we can't achieve this alone. So we developed our regional landscape pilot. to provide direct and significant funding to collaborative land management partnerships to help develop, plan, and implement project portfolios across the state.
So yeah, those landscape scale projects are really interesting. We've announced them at 3 of our previous task force meetings that funding would be available. They're being used to support the regional partnerships and the work that's coming out of the regional priority planning that Mary just spoke to. So what's interesting about these plans, though, is that it's not just forest health, for instance, that these groups are focused on. They're focused on community protection and fire prevention and watersheds. So what are the considerations for a funder, and especially looking at this program, when you need to reach across those different disciplines to think about how you can fund various parts of a project or a landscape plan?
Yeah, so specifically for our regional landscape pilot, like what it is they're large grants to regional collaborative entities that will then sub-grant to projects based on the priorities of that regional entity. So we really want them to support regional capacity and partnerships and prioritization. And then we're also hoping that it brings funding to those smaller projects and other organizations that necessarily wouldn't qualify for our larger, forest health program. And right now we only have 3 of them because we're hoping to really learn from these different pilots to see if, investing in other regions is beneficial. So the goals of them are just, again, as I said, prioritize coordinated forest and fuels work at a larger scale, building that regional capacity and with the collaboratives, supporting the equity, fairness, and inclusion of, maybe those smaller entities. So we do have the 3 that you will hear from them on a later panel today. But they're the North Coast Resource Partnership. We also worked with Sierra Nevada Conservancy with the Healthy El Dorado Landscape Partnership, and then our Southern California, which is the Greater San Diego RCD. So the first one was NRCP, which is the North Coast Resource Partnership. We awarded that or announced it at the fall 2022 task force meeting. That agreement was recently signed last year. They currently have their request for proposals open right now. And this is an individual RFFC. So this is the first one that we have, and it's the most furthest along. The second one is the Healthy El Dorado Landscape Partnership, and this one's a little bit different because it has multiple funding sources. So it has funding from the Forest Health Program, the Forest Service, and then also SNC. And there's also opportunity for other entities to provide funding as it becomes available for work that our programs just couldn't cover. And then the final one with San Diego, I think is the most interesting one because it's actually going to be utilizing 6 RFFCs, and each one of them is going to be splitting the funding equally between the 6 of them. But because Forest Health recognized that the landscape is so different in Southern California, we reached out to our wildfire prevention grant program to see if we could do a 50-50 split in the funding. So the funding is actually going to be $5 million of Forest Health and then $5 million of wildfire prevention, just recognizing the need for that, diverse area. And one of the things that we're learning, from that one, but then also the others, is that the prioritization processes are different between the 3 of them. But then also, especially for us with CAL FIRE and internally trying to merge our forest health and our wildfire prevention, there's been just trying to get consistency for our grant guidelines so that we meet both of those program requirements. So we're recognizing that challenge and trying to move forward with it.
Shannon, thank you. And thank you all for kind of connecting the dots and between all of these different processes. I'm going to turn it over to the executive committee. And I think we have until about 10:50, at which point we have a quick 5-minute wellness break.
Thanks so much. I have 2 initial questions and then I'd turn it to other committee members. Maybe the first is between Chief Tyler or Joe and Jen. On Good Neighbor Authority, thank you, Trevor, for sharing your presentation. I've been educated over the years that Good Neighbor Authority is an important tool in California. So I was really surprised to see those goose eggs in Trevor's presentation in terms of California's investment. I think that California has invested hundreds of millions of dollars of state money onto federal landscapes over the years. So I'm just interested to know, is that funding getting spent in ways outside of the capacity of Good Neighbor Authority? And what do you see as the potential to apply Good Neighbor Authority to funds we're already spending? I'm a little confused. Question number one. Question number two is, I wince when I see that funding, that initial graphic that you provided, because it demonstrates that I think we have upwards of 50 different funding programs. And we talk a good game about wanting to break down silos and recognize the comprehensive nature of these projects. Yet between our state and federal agencies, we still have this, this landscape of funding programs. To me, if you had a magic wand, you'd create like a one-stop, shop for funding. That's not going to happen because the Bureau of Land Management needs its programs and the Forest Service needs its programs. In the state, we have certain statutory programs that are funded by our legislature. We have conservancies in different places. So I understand that it's always going to be more complicated than we want it to be. But what are we doing to demystify this for folks on the ground, whether you're a county supervisor, county administrator, a local fire safe council? I mean, I don't want it to be that you have to get a really well-positioned, well-funded consultant to even understand how to apply for these programs. So I want to ask that challenging question to you as well. But first on Good Neighbor.
Well, I wish I could answer that question for you right here at the moment,
Okay.
and I certainly can't, but I will get back to you.
Okay, and I can provide just a little bit of quick context, and then Trevor, you might want to add in, because this is key to, the differing philosophies of how Good Neighbor is being used. The state has invested a lot of funding into work on Forest Service land, as the Forest Service has invested a lot of work on non-federal land within the state. But the specific mechanism by which that has been happening has not been the Good Neighbor Authority. And I think so that number severely underestimates or just doesn't even show the investments that have been made by California in federal landscapes, because it's very, very specific to those specific agreements and that specific authority. And so I'd like to ask, you told me earlier, Trevor, how Washington is using Good Neighbor, and is for a very specific piece. And what was that?
Yeah, that's correct. So the way I would describe it is it's state implemented work on federal lands. So you're using state employees, state resources, state funding to not just go step over the line for 10 minutes to go do something. It's actually a full investment of the sort of soup to nuts of a project. We're taking that project from impetus all the way through completion, using our contracts, using our appraisal processes, using our bidding processes, using all of the things that we do as a state agency. That's a key business function of Good Neighbor that is very different and is very beneficial to working with federal partners who often have pretty laborious processes through that. Here in California, you spend a lot of money investing by providing funding and at opportunities for folks to go over and work on federal lands. And there's 100 ways to do that. The difference when you work with Good Neighbor, at least in Washington, for example, and kind of the sign of maturity of it is switching from it being just a tool you use a one-off into becoming a full-fledged program where you have dedicated staff. And that's when things really change, because now you have people who are invested in the trenches with the Forest Service, like owning all of those things. And we've gotten to a point that we're now key members of their 5-year planning efforts and their forest plans, where they're actually counting on the state to accomplish a chunk of that work. And so that's the difference. We have lots of investment in Washington as well that has not been through Good Neighbor on federal lands. But so it's, again, like I said, it's taken the relationship that you guys have and it's bringing it to the next level, which is owning, sort of taking everything that you need to do to accomplish the work versus just maybe one part or another.
Yeah, thanks so much. I would just say, I don't know enough about the Good Neighbor Authority to know if utilizing the specific authority on our funding would provide certain benefits that we don't yet achieve. But I think, given Trevor's presentation, we should look into that. Because I want to ensure that, there's really strong coordination, which I know that there is, and I don't want people to take the conclusion that there isn't simply because Good Neighbor Authority hasn't been applied. That being said, if it's something we should apply that can improve our effectiveness or deepen the coordination, we should.
Can I add one last thing to that? So very quickly, the key factor that determines Good Neighbor is the state. It's the state or the partner. It could be a county or a tribe. The Forest Service wants to use that tool. It's been told them through the chief, all the way down through the regional offices, that it's a key tool. But the state has to be willing to come to the table to use it. So until the state steps up and says, all right, this is important to us as well, it won't be utilized because there's 1,000 ways to do it.
Yeah, I guess the point I want to make is the state has stepped up and is stepping up in major ways. And of the $200 million that the state was spending for quite a few years, a large portion of that, I think over half of that, was being spent on federal lands. So appreciate the presentation, but I'll just point out that that investment has been made, is being made, and we can look at, the application of this very specific program, the authority to understand if that would optimize the investment.
Perfect. Yep. CNRA will be renewing its Master Good Neighbor Authority Agreement, and CAL FIRE is already doing extensive work with BLM to utilize its framework to use state resources on federal lands for those purposes.
Great. I recognize Sam has a question, but I want you to answer that second question
For
first.
part two.
Yep.
And so what are we doing to make these funding sources more understandable, more accessible? So from a task force perspective, we do want to move forward in making, providing more tools and providing more accessibility to put these pieces together. Even today, and being able to share this information was the first step in ways that we haven't really done before. But I do want to pivot to Mary, because actually, let me say one more thing before I do that. There are also a lot of programs in the state that help to address that. For example, the Watershed Research and Training Center has partnered with the Forest Service and many others on a community navigator program, just to really provide that technical assistance, to meet with partnerships, help them understand what funding sources they may be able to apply for. But I want to turn it to Mary, because we see the regional priority plans as a key and significant mechanism to be able to match up particular funding sources with landscape portfolios of work. For the first time, we're seeing and developing our partnerships. Regional partners are developing those landscape portfolios. So can you maybe expand, Mary, if you feel comfortable with how you might see those connections being drawn to make funding more accessible to regional partnerships?
I'll give it my best shot. So like I said earlier, right, these landscape portfolios of projects, or these regional priority plans, really are, we're asking our partners to tell us what their priorities are and tell us how they want to organize their work. And so that looks really different across the board, but we feel like if we can just pull out and say, well, there's these top level strategies and there's these top level project types that we're seeing again and again, and really honestly matching the language with other programs. And like, it goes so far to be able to put a plan in front of someone from another agency and say, hey, look, they're really focused, a big priority for them is ignition reduction, as well as a minor priority on, I don't know, water quality. And then we can say, let's play matchmaker. Let's go to the water agencies. Let's go to, CAL FIRE, and let's make sure that these kind of match up. And so we do have draft, what we're calling them typologies for both northern regions and southern regions, just seeing, again, like we're hearing over and over again, there's just differences among the two. And we have been working with them, with all of our grantees closely on rounds of feedback, and feel pretty confident that it's something that they can, they feel like they're ready to buy into, and something we can really use.
Thank you, Mary. To take it just one step further, unless Patrick, you want to jump in. Those regional priority plans will form the basis for our regional investment strategies that will be a part of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan update in 2025, where the real intent for those regional funding strategies is to make sure that we're matching up the appropriate resources or potential resources that could fund this work beyond even wildfire funding to those regional priority plans and those regional strategies.
Can I put that map back up you just had up there? So we came up jointly with this concept 3 years ago with the action plan. So take Southern California, divide it into 6 subregions. In a perfect world, what we would do right now, hundreds of groups across Southern California separately submitting grant applications to dozens of different programs. So the theory was divide into 6 subregions with sub-leaders and a leader for Southern California as a whole, coordinate all the respective projects, state park projects, Forest Service projects, Caltrans projects, utility projects, and then CAL FIRE over here and other agencies give block grants to those 6 areas for their bundles of projects. So that helps solve the problem both of within Area 12, all these areas competing against each other, but also means all those dozens of groups don't have to hire people to understand dozens of projects. They can work in their 6 subregions with leaders who have that understanding that are working directly with you and with CAL FIRE. What we can do at our level is have a panel of CAL FIRE, Forest Service, Water Board, DWR at the table with the region as a whole and with those 6 areas to transition to block grants to support those 6 bundles of projects. What that takes, though, is each of those 6 areas having that plan, having buy-in, having the capacity to actually deliver. And candidly, only a couple of those 6 are there yet, right? And so those that aren't there are getting capacity building money to get to the point where they've got a plan that has buy-in, has a decision-making process associated with it. So that's the theory. What I'd love to hear is a candid reality check. What barriers and is that vision realistic from both of you to move towards scattered grants all across the landscape, more and more to block grants for implementation of bundles of projects in priority plans?
So I think our pilot will help to definitely see the pros and cons of that. Unfortunately, this one isn't as far along as our other 2 because it is working with those 6 individual RFFCs. And we do have DOC working with us as well when we're having our meetings with them. I think that the block grants, they provide flexibility and more local control and priorities. But I also think that having, the competitive process also has its benefits, especially for us, because we're ensuring, that those state and our local unit priorities are also being voiced. And in tighter budget times, you're ensuring that those higher priority, higher benefit projects are actually getting completed. So I think it's for CAL FIRE, we're hoping that this pilot provides us with some of that information.
I'll just add that I think it's a really valid concern. And actually, when I hear from some of my grantees I work with directly who are earlier in the process, they're saying, well, should I really be investing all this work into doing this large plan if afterwards I'm just going to have to do the same thing over again of applying for competitive grants to do implementation? And so something I've been reflecting on is I think that it could work to a certain extent. I think it's really important to have other funding sources for smaller projects and meet those smaller needs as well. But I think it could work with lots of coordination on the state level.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll just emphasize lastly that I think we're moving in the right direction. So I want to emphasize that. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation and Forrest, you're able to put up that graphic and demystify what is, has been too opaque to a lot of people, I think is really important. And I really appreciate, Shannon, that the funding programs within the state are talking to each other about these projects and blending funding where possible. And I think we need to continue to drive that forward. And I do think this regional, framework is the right approach because simply put, the people in these regions know best about where their vulnerabilities exist and where their priorities exist. So I think we're on the right path. Just know that, my tough questions are just, the urgency to continue to make progress on this, which I think we're making. I see Sam and then Supervisor Valenzuela.
Sure. Just a couple of questions and comments. I think, Shannon, so the OPR biomass pilots, we have 8 going on, are actually exploring the Good Neighbors Authority as an opportunity in 18 counties in Northern California as an opportunity to advance business opportunities for them. And then our FFC is also what we're looking at as the priority areas identified. For example, if there's hazard removal, so fuel facilities, then create that opportunity where business opportunities for the biomass that is removed so that we connect the dots and then directly incentivize the businesses in biomass. They're struggling now. There are new ones that are popping up, but they're having a hard time finding financing. So what we're trying to do is how does the state actually help facilitate to create business opportunities for that? There's any sort of feedback or ideas that you may have?
So we do have our business and workforce development grants, but which is through our wood products and bioenergy program. And I know that they do work with OPR, so they would be the best connectors for that.
Thanks.
And I would just add, and again, being candid, we always want these meetings to be honest and candid. Biomass is an area where we, that the task force is developing this woody biomass strategy. Biomass is a critical area that we have to be able to tackle more comprehensively in the state. And Sam, I appreciate OPR has made these investments in these pilots. There's more work we have to do to ensure that, there are economically beneficial and productive ways to get the vegetation off the landscape. And we're not there right now.
Yeah.
So let's just recognize that it's unfinished business that we have to focus on in an urgent way. Supervisor.
Yes, thank you. Real quick, and Mr. Crawford, you mentioned about all these different pots of money. I would remind everyone here that rural counties are very capacity constrained. So think about it from that perspective. How can you engage a county? Because there's a lot of advantages. So I'm going to use Cal OES and the home hardening grant, and Sierra Nevada Conservancy that come in, that they're able to take some of that burden off. But small rural counties, which takes a huge swath of land, are capacity constrained. Thank you.
Yeah, really good point. And I think in some of these regional leadership, groups that we've helped to fund, counties are really need to be in the center of that, right? And so the supervisor, on the North Coast Resource Partnership, I don't know if that covers Siskiyou, but I hope that those counties in that Northern California are plugged into those regional leadership groups, right? Because to the extent that they have priorities, we need those reflected within the regional plans. Is that fair? Okay. Good.
I just wanted to make one last point on Good Neighbor before we leave, which is we're absolutely right. State money is pouring into projects that are on Forest Service land. The issue is we're not using state staff to do work on Forest Service land. So what we need to do following this meeting, and I've had some spirited conversations with Trevor about this, and the fact that state agencies are really overstretched right now. And so finding the capacity, not just to do their own work, but to do work on Forest Service land is a real challenge. So what we need to do is work with CAL FIRE, the Forest Service, and others to think about areas where that actually makes sense. Maybe it's fuel breaks that CAL FIRE is building, and then you're running into federal lands. You want to extend it. Maybe it's a large landscape project that crosses state and federal land. So what we need to do to make use of this is think about those specific areas where it does make sense, not just to spend state money on federal land, but actually have state staff also partner with the Forest Service to get work done there. So we will definitely do that.
And I would say if it makes sense, because we have a lot of tools, on the ground. So we never want to avoid using a tool that's going to help and advance our efforts if it makes sense. Joe, did you have no, you're good? Okay. And there's one piece. I know that Liz wanted to do a follow-up on this, so
Yeah,
please
just
go.
adding from the federal side a little bit here. So Trevor's data wasn't from the whole for, an indefinite period of time. It was just showing a short period. So that was a good snapshot. We actually got over $1 million to SNC for Good Neighbor Authority this year. So I think he showed about 3 million for just this year. And that's for the Healthy El Dorado landscape. So when we talk about prioritizing in certain key areas and aligning together, we've heard about that through the panelists here. So we're all investing our money there using multiple tools. And so I think what we're daylighting here is there's a story to tell, and there's multiple different components between the tools, all the different funding sources, all the different partners, and then of course we can do more. So it's a combo of these things, and that's where it gets confusing for the partners, and I think the storytelling is helpful as well as what tool works best where, whether it's the implementation tool or the authority. And like we talked about, we have so many of those, but just this last year alone, $3 million on the Forest Service side to go to the state. We've used master stewardship agreements and other authorities to actually fund state employees and vice versa. So we have that too. So maybe that's a future conversation to be had about what tools we're using where and where the funding is aligned. Because just the Good Neighbor Authority example, I think is a good one. We're all talking about the same landscape, multiple tools and multiple funding sources.
Yeah, and I just wanted to give a shout out to our state conservancies. There's 10 of them, and the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, for example, has been brought up. And the supervisor's point, the notion of our place-based conservancies is that they do a lot of the work in identifying what are the resources, what are the funding, so that the local folks don't have to do that work themselves. And I guess my last point would be, again, we're making progress, but in the past, my observation is that government funding programs don't challenge themselves enough to be better for the people that use the funding. And here, I think we're doing that. And I commend the task force staff for doing that. But I think we continue to have to work between the state and federal governments to do more to make it easier to access this funding, to ensure that when these regional leaders come together, that we can pool funding for their priorities more. Like I said, I think we're on the right step, but I think this has to be a key priority moving forward.
Great, thank you. We have planned a quick 5-minute wellness break. And I do want to provide an opportunity for people to stretch their legs or use the restroom if they need.